Thanks, everybody, for coming by today for this session. There's so many great sessions, no shortage of opportunity to learn and to see what other folks are doing. But for us, I'm Ross MacDonald, Public Transit Program Manager at VTrans. And today we're talking about Microtransit, a demand response service that we're trying to assess and figure out if there is a viable, sustainable role for microtransit in Vermont. And so it's always helpful to start with transit writ large. And what is transit in Vermont? Other than we know that there are going to be gaps, Vermont enjoys, what time is it?
Ladies and gentlemen, Ross MacDonald. How'd I do?
That was great. Good to see you, Brian. And it's been a while. And yeah, I just wanted to get started because I wanted to have time at the end, Brian, certainly for not only microtransit questions, but other issues, ideas, questions about transit. I don't want to just keep it so narrow if there's other items that we have time for. So I appreciate being able to jump the gun a little bit. And in Vermont, if we were like most rural states, we would have a budget of around $12 or $13 million. And that's because we have FTA, Federal Transit Administration, formula funds that we get directly based on population in general. And then in Vermont, though, we take that $12 million and we add $23 million from our Bridge and Road Program, or FHWA funds. And then we still grab another $10 million from our transportation funds. And so all told, over 65% of our funds come from other funds that other than FTA or Federal Transit Administration funds. And that means about $60 per person investment for public transit in Vermont. Other states that border us are in the single digits, maybe $4 or $5 a person. And so with all of that, we know that there's remains incredible gaps: transportation, elderly, job workforce, all of those things. But what we can do is try to use these funds to look at other modes, other vehicles, other partnerships in a small state like Vermont that can allow us to really test out for a lot of rural areas in the country. It's interesting, in national webinars and meetings we go to and talk about, wow, how did you get such a robust system? And then I leave those conferences and come here and we have constant conversations about all the gaps that exist. And so we're not going to be able to use traditional transit funding and traditional transit modes to get everybody to where they want to get to when they need to get there. And so for us, we have our fixed route services, and that level of funding does allow us to cover most of the well-traveled corridors around the state to baseline foundation levels. We have deviated fixed routes in those smaller towns where if you're within a 3/4 mile area, that fixed route service will come off and pick up people on request. We also have 2 demand response programs that our providers oversee: the older adults and persons with disability, and the non-emergency medical transportation program, which is the Medicaid program. That's about 700,000 trips a year. We also support intercity services to get along our corridors to the intercity network. And we have a transportation demand management program, or the Go Vermont program, that item that I mentioned earlier today, a one-click, one-call resource for people to figure out if there are non-single occupancy vehicle options for them. We have a call center and a bunch of information on our website, and we have folks who are doing outreach on behalf of that program full-time. But microtransit came on the scene really as a tail end of when Uber and Lyft and the other real-time on-demand services started really changing the dynamics around transportation. And what it meant for transit was, instead of serve a corridor or a route, could we better serve a region, especially in Vermont where we don't have the density that would justify 3 or 4 different routes? Could we rather rasterize or establish a region, and anybody in that area could use an app or a phone and schedule a trip in real time or even pre-book so that they know that they're covered to get to their doctor's appointment, shopping, wherever they'd like to go. One of the benefits is, as I mentioned on the demand response program, you need to be eligible, over 60 or with a disability or on Medicaid or in recovery or looking for a job. But this is for everybody, general public, and we talk about equity. And how can we achieve equity and ensure that people who break their leg and can't drive, their partner is left and they took the car, all the phone calls that we've received at VTrans and Go Vermont and so many people here working with their clients, if we had a singular set of infrastructure and resources for everybody to use and to get around, why wouldn't we want to study it? And then the salespeople tell us that we're going to have 2.5 times the ridership and all of these things. And so we'd be remiss in our duties as a leader in rural transit if we weren't looking at microtransit. So we know that we were looking at plateaued ridership levels, that we have an aging population within the next half generation, a full third of us will be over 60. Cost of transit services continue to inch up, but we also have new technologies like the Uber and Lyft dynamic technology for us to use. We have better planning tools. We have better systems on board to show onboarding and route performance. Does this service provide more flexibility? More people are able to access the service because they don't have to walk the 1.5 or a mile to the bus stop. Would it be more convenient for people to be able to dial up a ride that says, yes, we'll be there in 20 minutes, and then you can plan around that rather than sitting at that bus stop hoping that it's on schedule. And if it's deviated fixed route, many times it won't be on schedule because they've deviated to go pick somebody up. And we were looking at successful case studies. A lot of those case studies are in the urban area. So how do you right size that in a state like Vermont? Well, you study it. And the first thing we did was do a statewide range of feasibility studies. And we did this and we went to our public transit providers. We have 7 of them throughout the state. And said, which communities, knowing what we know about microtransit, would you like to consider? And so people in Green Mountain Community Network in the southwest of the state, they said, well, we'd like to look at Bennington and Manchester. And so you start looking at what do we have in Bennington? What are the recommendations and estimates? And we did that in 14 different communities, trying to pick out towns as disparate as Barrie and Windsor and St. Albans, Williston in this area, and Montpelier, those types of communities. It's really been instrumental because you don't know what you don't know until you get these folks at VIA and these planners who take a look at our service levels in, let's say, Bennington. And they said, you know what, with this type of service and for what you're spending on that, you shouldn't go to a microtransit service. You're capturing most of the neighborhoods. You're going to most areas that they would travel. And however, this community over here has no transit, but you have a lot of demand response services for elderly, persons with disability, Medicaid. What about that region? And so as a result, we were able to kind of understand, broad brush with those 14 case studies, which communities we would like to further study. And then we started looking at this assessment where anywhere from Bennington down to Windsor, we started dialing out the annual costs. How much would it cost per ride? Right now, our demand response services, that includes 60% volunteer drivers, our professional drivers with ADA accessible vehicles and other contracts, were about $24 pre-COVID, It's now hovering around $33 per person. After COVID, we lost a lot of volunteers. We're starting to build back that infrastructure. But you can see that even when we look at serving all these disparate populations with different number of vehicles, utilization, how many folks would use those vehicles on a per hour basis, we see this wide range. But what we didn't see is $7, 33 people an hour. We just didn't see that big pickup because we know that most folks, 6% of our travel around the state is done with individual cars. Expecting them to get out of their cars, to use microtransit and go through that process is something that needs to be factored into those algorithms and those assessments. So we took a look at these outcomes. We've continued to do feasibility studies through the Mobility and Transportation Innovation competitive grant program that we run through the Vermont program, and said, okay, well, let's take a look at Morrisville and Windsor and Manchester and Barrie and Middlebury, trying to figure out, well, there's a college town with some good, robust service. Wouldn't that be better than having one circular vehicle going around all day? Let's put two vehicles on and start doing this demand response microtransit. So what we've been doing is spending some time at sharing with the legislature these plans. They made available $500,000 for the non-federal match. These services are new, which means that it qualifies for 80-20 federal funds. Once before the IIJA and the bipartisan infrastructure law, after 3 years of a new study or a new service, that would then come into our standard operations at 50-50, federal, non-federal. The new rule that we have planners who were instrumental in making this happen with our federal delegation allows for CMAQ funds, congestion mitigation air quality funds, of which we get about $12 million into the state every year, that a portion of that can be used through our flex dollars that we get for public transit at 80-20 for new services forever. That is a game changer because, as I mentioned, with our transit funds, we're using almost all of that for operations. That's the 50-50 money that we generally couldn't use for operations with those other funds, those other federal funds. And so now, using CMAQ dollars and standing up these 4 and 5 pilots, the legislature said, well, here's an extra $500,000 for the non-federal match. That allows us to sustain current services while we test the new services. That's the type of coordination and assistance and support that this program enjoys in the state. And we learned through these studies that urban, sometimes it's suitable, evenings and weekends in Brattleboro, in the North End, in Rutland. That makes sense. Probably doesn't make sense to take the 13 routes away from Burlington and say, okay, there's 13 vehicles and go everywhere. I've been on the speaking circuit around the country with a town called Wilson, North Carolina, about the same size as Burlington. They had one route. And they said, well, now we have 7 vehicles going around and look at our ridership and it's going so well. And people say, well, why don't you do that in Burlington? Because we have so many of that fixed route service that you can rely on, that you can live your life without a car. That wasn't the case in so many cities around the country. In small towns, again, that circulator that we have in a dozen or more towns, would it be better to replace that route with a service region? We think that is suitable. Demand response, as I mentioned, 700,000 trips out of the 5 million that are paid for through public transit and Medicaid funds are demand response. Why do we have the circulator route and the demand response serving elderly persons with disability? Could we put everybody on the same infrastructure with the same service and quality? So we think that is suitable. Tourism. this was interesting because I thought, yeah, folks in Killington will come up there, they'll open up the app and then they'll use the service. But what VIA was informing us was that's not what's happening generally, because people go on vacation, they want to download an app for 3 nights or 2 nights and there's a learning curve there, and they're showing up in a Mercedes with, you know, their family with all their ski gear and the like. It's not exactly the way that we'd anticipated it. And so again, learning the some of the nuance to microtransit. Rural areas certainly is suitable. Again, combining that with our other demand response service. Folks who would talk about, well, you know, instead of US 2 commuter going from St. Johnsbury to Montpelier, where you can connect to the link service that brings you up to Burlington, you know, let's do that. But that doesn't work because you don't. A commuter schedule needs to be on time, and the longer you use a trunk, then the larger that area is going to be, and you're really limited to get off that schedule and to serve that very large area. You'll see later, we've got just an initial snapshot of where we are with our pilots, and you know, you'll see the square miles that are being served. But to serve a 83 square mile area with a few buses just isn't going to work for most people. And then the volunteer program, this is where I differed a little bit with our consultants who perform these feasibility studies. Said likely unsuitable. You know, we have so many volunteers that have come into the system wanting to help their communities and get people to and from their services. They get a mileage reimbursement. And we thought, well, if they were part, and there's background checks to ensure that they're just as safe as can be, that we could then utilize this service and provide them with a laptop or a tablet, set it up in their car, and that they could be on demand and help us provide those trips. And if you needed ADA accessible vehicles, well, then we would have that capacity out there. In addition to volunteers, that could be a pilot to consider in the coming years for sure. And so we've had 3 years almost of the MyRide pilot in Montpelier, and then we have about 6 months or less of the pilots that were just stood up in the last fiscal year. And so the strengths really are the flexibility of scheduling trips, able to meet folks closer to door and hoping that we're not close enough, have a bus stop close to them. We know that we can go closer to the client. It does increase awareness and perceived value of public transit and real value of public transit. Reducing the average length of time passengers on the bus. If you're on a circulator route and it takes an hour to cycle through, you might be getting on at one stop and on it for 45 minutes to just go 2 miles that way. And so rather than that, we're seeing average time on the bus 10, 15 minutes, not that 50 minutes of just waiting to get to that stop. So that's no small item, because why don't people take the bus? It's not as convenient as our cars. And that's why 75% or more of our riders are needs riders. They don't have other options. If you have other options, it's not the financial benefit of taking transit that would get you to take transit. It's that convenience factor. It's just not as convenient. So we did want to see if the Uber and Lyft model and this technology is being so important to our individual choices in our urban areas. You know, what does that look like? That's our responsibility, is to see what these new modes and approaches to mobility can mean in the state. And then eliminates the need to handle deviations on the prior fixed routes, eliminates the need to provide a redundant vehicle providing demand response services in an area that is being covered by some of those routes. And then it is easy to use for those with smartphones, and riders can see where the vehicle is coming. And so, okay, they said they're going to be in 2 minutes, and here it comes, there it is. And so no small item. The number one concern for people is, where's my bus? And to sit there on at the bus stop and not be sure where it is, you've got your own schedule, to see that real-time automated vehicle location information is key. And we know it's key because we have statewide transit app. And the transit app covers the 112 routes that we have, plus our intercity services around the state. And 8,000 people a week use it. And so just boom, this is my route, and here it's coming, and you get on the bus, and I'm going to be there in 12 minutes. That's the type of information that is baseline expectation, whether you're on a plane, a train, and now on the bus in Vermont. It is, I believe, the only statewide AVL program under one brand, one app. We're trying to do this together with all of our providers and not have, oh, you're in this region, it's this app. We really want to make this simple for all Vermonters wherever you are. And then through the Go Vermont statewide program, then we can be more meaningful and easier to communicate with people. Folks were talking about how concerning it is for new people to access the bus. Is there going to be a fare? What's the expectation? Who's going to be on that bus? The easier we make it and the more convenient it is our primary goals for us. Weaknesses of the MyRide program. And lack of a fixed schedule can be a hindrance for commuters, for people without a phone, for the unhoused. 70% of the respondents in the first survey in the Montpelier MyRide area said, yeah, we like this demand response service. It's all the things that we talked about. 30%, no small insignificant number, said, I just like going to the bus stop. I could wait. I knew it was coming eventually, and I didn't have to engage with the system and the operations side of things. They just appreciated that. There is a susceptibility of system no-shows and cancellations. Some folks have figured out, like, hey, I need to go somewhere this afternoon. I don't know if I'll be out by 1 or 2. Let me put them both in, and I'll just use the one that I want. That's a killer for operational efficiency. We're expecting to pick up that person. They're a no-show. This other person's waiting over here. We could have gotten them already. So the question is, should we be adding a fare or a charge for a reservation that would prevent a little bit of that occurring? Interestingly enough, one of the things is the lack of options for high schoolers. And we can see through that MyRide app all of those high schoolers gaming the system, and we have so much service there scheduled, and that's where the highest rate of cancellation and no-shows are. It's not their fault. They just figure, like, I found the trick. There is the challenge in fine-tuning the algorithm. We started with 3 vehicles, morning, noon, and night. And then we found out we need that 4th vehicle in the morning and evening to pick up that initial latent demand and to finish up that last part of demand. So for that first few hours and that last hour or two, really needed to build that capacity to clear the system. The lack of reporting, we need the reporting for our Medicaid program, for our elderly and persons with disability program. How do we know who is getting on that bus? And how do we know how much to bill these other programs? Well, there's ways to get around it. We can take a look at before Microtransit and Montpelier were serving 132 unique individual clients. And now with the MyRide system, we can assume that this percentage is being served, but we're not there yet. We need to get through this. We do hope that through these pilots, we have 3 different software providers. Who's got the best reporting and billing, who's got the best service, who's got the most ease of use to become an account and a member. All of that is being assessed as well. We didn't want to just go with the folks who did our feasibility studies and said, okay, we want 5 pilots. We did this with AVL, that automated vehicle location program, where we had 4 different AVL pilots up, and then we were able to choose the best mousetrap for Vermont at the end of that process. That's the method to the madness with our current pilots here. And then the circumstances of the special circumstances, you pre-booked your trip, we're all set, and the snowstorm comes, and you're looking at that bus, and it's not moving because it's on the side of the road in the ditch. And so that communication, is something that we're like, oh, right, things can happen on the operational side, just not only for the rider side of things as well. And then that peak hour capacity. We can put more vehicles on either side to deal with that, but then we have to be aware of what are those special events coming down the pike, what's the likely ebbs and flows, not only on a day-to-day basis, seasonal event, all of those things need to be incorporated into the plan. So the next steps, address the Montpelier weaknesses. They're down to 2 vehicles because of capacity issues. Nothing we can do about that, but now not 50% of the folks are pre-booking, 80% of the people, 87% of the people are pre-booking because they know, like, during that day, that capacity is full with the pre-book. I better pre-book. The pilot data is now off, and it's not useless, but it isn't as helpful as we were hoping to have 3 years in. So we'll address that. That's being addressed. Maybe folks have heard GMT talk about that by the end of this calendar year, they expect to have enough drivers to get back to pre-issue service. That'd be 3 vehicles, 4 on the shoulders of the day. We continue to fund additional feasibility studies to see what it could look like. Stand-up pilots and study the effectiveness. And you'll see that the pilots really did try to do everything, and Barry's coming in the next year, but we really wanted to see what it would look like in a college town with some service, what it would look like in Morrisville with 1 vehicle going around with really a paucity of other options in the area. We're in Montpelier. Windsor was chosen because they have a lot of service needs with no transit service in place. So what does that look like? And Manchester, again, we think of Manchester as a very wealthy community, but that wealthy community needs a lot of workforce, staff, and housing. And that was another scenario we wanted to test. One scenario we haven't tested was that evening weekend in some of our larger towns, the Rutland, the Brattleboro area, for example. I'm hoping that once we establish post-COVID sustainability needs for our budget, if there's anything left on the bone, we would like to test that scenario out. But as of this time, just got this last week, really rudimentary, and we've got a couple other columns, but I thought these would be the most interesting to share today. Number of trip requests provided, 61, 71, 82, 80, to be determined. Middlebury's coming on board next month, and you can see where they're estimating from the feasibility study. Well, we estimate 9 minutes and 7 minutes on. That looks about right. Estimating about 9 minutes wait time. Well, could be a little bit more, but that's a pretty dense community with some services in that town center. Maybe it's going to be closer to 10 minutes. And pilot cost per passenger, when we start at Windsor and we look at almost $40 in FY23, that was ramp up of their advertising, getting out, talking to the doctor's offices and the clients. They're already down to about that $24 range, which is something we hope we can live with. Morrisville, different rates, different transit rates go into this, $15. Manchester, 19 to 25. Again, they're just getting underway in August, but they didn't want to just say 25 because they already projected they'll be at 19 by the end of this fiscal year. But when we look at the region size, 12 miles, 21.8 miles for Windsor, Morrisville, 22.93. We're getting to the outer edges, but that's what rural transit looks like. Large areas to serve as many people as possible. And so as we move forward, these numbers have to be well over 90%. I mean, if you have 18 people out of 100 who are saying, "Oh, sorry, try again in a few minutes," or "No, nothing available today," that's not what we were hoping to see. So when we first looked at this microtransit, we thought any small town with a circulator route will transition to microtransit because it'll be more meaningful to more people to get to more places rather than anticipate where most people would like to go and where we need to pick them up. We're not as confident now in that approach, and we really need to let these pilots breathe and to adapt. We will continue. These are in their first year of their pilots. We've got 3 years of pilot assessment to go. The good news that I can share with you is that the software is working very well, that the ease of becoming a customer, that seems to be doing pretty well. Drivers generally don't like to be told where to go. Like, "Oh, they tell me take a right here. I know where I'm going. It's because somebody was just about to, get in on a trip that hadn't been recorded yet for that person." And so we do have some of those issues to move through. But the VT Digger article last week talking about this new service in Windsor and people being interviewed and really appreciating what it means to them as versus waiting 2 days to book a trip for somebody to get to a doctor's appointment. They are doing it that same day. And then after the appointment, they're booking that trip to go to the pharmacy to pick up what they need. It's not like a different trip on a different day. And so this is the type of benefit that we need to continue to learn from. But we'll be updating this every 6 months throughout the coming years. And we may see another, evening and weekend scenario if we can swing it through our budget process. So, that's Microtransit in Vermont at this point. And I'd love to hear what you guys are thinking or if you have any questions. Hi, Peggy.
Thank you, Ross. Before we go in, I want to recognize, despite my tardiness, I am the facilitator / moderator and bodyguard.
And good looking.
Thanks. So we have a few minutes before the next session or the next break, whatever. So I'm sure Ross will entertain some questions. So I don't want to break up the party. I just want to do my duties.
Thanks, Brian. Peggy?
This is probably harder to measure, but do you have any data, I guess non-failure would be the best one, users, or no, non-users who are now using Myra? So those Cousin Sally was driving on Myrtle to her appointments before, but now on Myrtle can use Myra. Were you able to capture any of that, as well as any folks who have sort of dropped off and are now using Cousin Sally because Myra isn't working with that?
Mm-hmm. On the first part, I think that was anecdotally captured through the surveys that were conducted, and it did seem like there were 30% increase in individual users. Folks that said, "You know what, I will use that for my commute because it's going to come to my home," or "I will, now I can see that it can come closer to my place. It's going to go to exactly where I want to go, the wildlife center, the college, those things, the ball fields." Again, a lot of youth that would never have those types of options. On the other side of it, ridership is up 3, 4, 5% pre-COVID. As soon as we launched this thing, within 3 months, COVID hit, but we did have at least the ridership before. And when we look at the ridership increases since the pandemic has ended to an extent, it does seem to have built back plus a little bit more. And so so far, I think that's what we have, it's tough to get that particular. We always struggle. We know that the trips we give, it's the trips we don't give. And so that's why we're trying to develop more denial reports and cancellation reports to figure out, why was that trip not provided versus, just tell me more about the trips that were provided. So that's all I can say now. Hi.
How have you coordinated with these communities in terms of education and outreach? Because there's obviously the community newsletter that says this program is launching, but an education program for maybe folks who are less tech literate.
Yeah.
And different things like that.
Thanks for that question, because whether it was VIA or Spare or QRide, the three software providers that we have running these pilots, they each showed up and said the number one factor of success is going to be community involvement because of everything you mentioned. It's mode change, it's behavior change. It's also asking people to come out of their cars more often or to share it with people they know that have mobility issues at church. And so I'm thankful that the transit providers have constituted advisory committees in these areas, have done that due diligence, work for the earned media, and continue to, that VT Digger article was pushed out because somebody called them and said, hey, we have some data. Do you want to learn more about that? Now Windsor is in the paper and they can say, yeah, you know what? Like, this is meaningful to my community. Let me try it. Also, that feedback, that idea of we need to go to the senior center and spend not one day a month for the next 7 months to try to get folks comfortable with the use. And one of the great things, 10 years ago, we were really nervous about our aging population and inabilities to work through IT. And my 83-year-old father uses Teams better than I do, and I use it all day long. And so it's been really heartening and good to see the utilization being done by our aging community. But it's the folks who may have mental challenges, the houseless population, and where are they going to go to talk with somebody to schedule that trip? That's part of the outreach as well. Some folks say, well, we need Sprinter vans. We want the smaller vans. They're narrow body, they're smoother, cheaper, easier to maintain, all the things that we get to talk about. But it's also close quarters, and if that's full, it can be something that folks wouldn't want to run to, as opposed to being on a large bus with 16 people and 35 seats. I've heard some of that feedback where I was like, oh no, we're going to get Sprinters and put them on. It's going to look cool. We can brand it specifically. I'm like, I don't know about that. So those are the types of things we learn. It is critical.
I just have a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
For the education accessibility, I don't know which app you landed on. Is it available in different languages?
The transit app is, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's a Montreal-based company. They're in 2,000 cities around the world, but it is something that I'm not sure of. That's a good question.
Yeah, I've only
Brian, do you know?
used it in English.
No, I'm waiting for Jamie.
But Jamie's looking, thankfully. We'll let him generate that answer. Sir.
As a follow-up, as you go forward with this, are you going to be able to calibrate for each community, what is the threshold for, even with the 50-50 split, to qualify or to basically say that this is a sustainable service?
So right now, what we've invested in, we're trying to ensure that we're not investing in services that cannot be sustained. It's the worst thing to do is to provide something and then take it away because of finances, especially if it's working. So we have a study that the legislature has requested for this coming session, which is non-federal match and other revenue approaches to support transit. Right now, as I mentioned, that $10 million we get from state funds, we also get generate about $7 million in local funds from our providers to help match that federal dollars. I mentioned that we're at the ceiling of using those federal dollars, might have some more federal. Moving forward, we may be in a position where we talk to towns and say, you know what, if we want microtransit, it's going to require extra funds. It'll be worth it, but it will be expensive. If you're not able to do that in a community because of poverty, if you're in an area of persistent poverty, are we then going to be able to justify coming in with additional support in those areas that can afford it, that, will come up with that? Then we may very well be not asking for $3,000 or $30,000 a year to support transit. It could be double that, but it could be worth it if we do this correctly. Marshall.
In thinking about vehicle types and affordability and efficiency for these microtransit vehicles, is it a requirement that they all are wheelchair accessible? It is.
It is, absolutely. We know that one scenario that we were thinking is there's community rides or Gopher in Barrie that has stood up their own program as part of Capstone, or using Capstone as an umbrella company. And we're saying, well, if they could be part of the Barrie Microtransit Pilot, maybe they could provide the trips. And then when people need ADA accessibility, that's when we bring in the GMT full boat service and cost. So is that another delivery option? And the sprinters, yes, that's one thing, but we want them to be electric sprinters for the greenhouse gas. And if you're in those small towns, it's just a lot of idling, right, that we don't need in the air. And so there's two pieces to that. But yeah, right now, every vehicle is ADA accessible. Thanks for the question.
Just to answer the language question, Transit app supports the following languages: English, French, Spanish, Italian, German, Portuguese, and Dutch, and it's based on the language that your phone is set to.
So not great for our new Americans in so many areas, but there are some. Thank you for that.
And I just want to recognize the next sessions are starting in 1 minute and 15 seconds if their facilitator is on time. So thank you all for joining Ross's discussion. Thank you, Ross, for being here.
Thank you.